Today I've gathered 11 disturbing true stories from real people in small towns across America. These aren't urban legends. These are genuine testimonies from survivors who finally found the courage to speak out. Each story gets progressively more disturbing, proving that sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that look the safest. So prepare yourself for 11 disturbing true small-town horror stories. Let's begin. My name is Demi, and I need to tell you about what happened when I moved to Milbrook Valley, Ohio 3 years ago. I was 25 then, working in marketing for a tech company in Columbus, and I was completely burned out from city life. The traffic, the noise, the constant pressure. I was having panic attacks almost daily. When I saw the listing for a small cottage on Maple Street in Milbrook Valley, population 847, I thought I'd found my salvation. The photos showed tree-lined streets, a charming main street with a hardware store and a diner called Mabel's Kitchen, and rolling farmland as far as the eye could see. The rent was incredibly cheap, only $600 a month for a 2-bedroom cottage with a wraparound porch. I signed the lease sight unseen. The first red flag should have been how eager the landlord, Mr. Henderson, was to get me moved in immediately. He waived the security deposit, didn't ask for references, and even offered to help me move my things from Columbus. But I was so desperate to escape the city that I ignored every instinct telling me something wasn't right. The day I arrived in Milbrook Valley, pulling my U-Haul down Main Street, I noticed how people stopped what they were doing to stare. Not the casual curiosity you'd expect in a small town, but intense, almost hungry stares that made my skin crawl. Within hours of parking in my new driveway, the visitors started arriving. First was Mrs. Caldwell from across the street, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She brought a casserole, tuna noodle, she called it, and insisted on helping me unpack. While I was grateful for the help, something about the way she moved through my house, opening cabinets and drawers like she was taking inventory, made me uncomfortable. She asked pointed questions about my family, my job, whether anyone would be visiting me soon. When I mentioned I was planning to work remotely and didn't know anyone in the area, her smile got even wider. The next morning, I woke up feeling incredibly groggy, which was strange because I'd gone to bed early. I stumbled to the kitchen to make coffee and found that someone had been in my house. The casserole dish had been washed and placed neatly by my sink, and there was a fresh loaf of bread on my counter with a note from someone named Betty saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood." My front door was still locked, and I distinctly remembered locking all the windows before bed. Checked my spare key hiding spot under the porch flower pot. It was still there, but the dirt around it had been disturbed. Over the next few days, the stream of visitors continued. Tom from the hardware store brought me a welcome basket with local honey and homemade jam. Pastor Williams from the community church stopped by with information about Sunday services and the weekly potluck dinners. The mailman, Eddie, lingered on my porch longer than necessary, asking about my background and commenting on how peaceful it must be to live alone. Every single person who visited brought food, cookies, pies, soups, more casseroles than one person could eat in a month. They all insisted I try whatever they brought while they were there, watching me take that first bite with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I started noticing patterns. The grogginess became a regular occurrence, especially after eating anything my neighbors brought. I'd wake up disoriented, sometimes with gaps in my memory from the night before. My laptop would be in slightly different positions, and I began finding small items moved around my house. A picture frame turned at a different angle. Books rearranged on my shelf. My medication bottles in the bathroom cabinet shifted around. When I mentioned these things to my visitors, they'd laugh it off, suggesting I was probably just stressed from the move and imagining things. The breaking point came 3 weeks after I'd moved in. I woke up one morning to find my wallet on my kitchen table, even though I was certain I'd left it in my purse in the bedroom. My credit cards were still there, but my cash was gone. About $200 I'd withdrawn for groceries. When I called the sheriff's department, Deputy Marshal arrived within minutes, almost like he'd been waiting for the call. He was a large man with cold gray eyes, who took my report with what seemed like practiced disinterest. He suggested I might have misplaced the money during the stress of moving and promised to keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. That night, I pretended to eat the soup Mrs. Caldwell had brought over, but secretly dumped it down the sink when she wasn't looking. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly and woke up completely alert. I used this clarity to set up a small, hidden camera I'd ordered online, positioning it to watch my front door and living room. The footage from that first night revealed everything I'd feared and more. At 2:47 a.m., I watched Deputy Marshal use a key to enter my house, followed by Mrs. Caldwell and 2 other people I recognized from the diner. They moved through my home with practiced efficiency, photographing documents, going through my laptop, and taking small amounts of cash from my purse. I kept recording for 3 more nights, gathering evidence of their systematic invasion of my privacy and theft of my belongings. They had keys to every lock, knew exactly where I kept everything, and had clearly been drugging me through the food they brought. On the recordings, I could hear them discussing other newcomers they'd processed over the years. They talked about bank account numbers, social security information, and how long they usually waited before people either left town or had accidents. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned someone named Janet who'd asked too many questions and ended up in a car crash on Route 34 6 months earlier. The most chilling part was listening to them discuss me specifically. Deputy Marshal mentioned that I had good credit and a steady remote income, making me a long-term prospect rather than just a quick cash grab. Mrs. Caldwell suggested they could keep me drugged and compliant for months, maybe even years, slowly draining my accounts while I thought I was just having trouble adjusting to small-town life. They had done this before, many times, to people who thought they were escaping to a simpler life in rural Ohio. I spent the next day pretending everything was normal while secretly packing my essential items and transferring my money to a new bank account. That evening, I left town with just 1 suitcase and my laptop, telling anyone who asked that I was visiting family for the weekend. I drove straight to the FBI field office in Cleveland and turned over all my video evidence. The agent I spoke with, Agent Rodriguez, seemed familiar with similar cases and told me I was lucky to have figured it out so quickly. She explained that they'd been investigating reports of financial crimes in rural Ohio communities, but had never had this level of evidence before. 3 months later, I learned that the entire Milbrook Valley operation had been dismantled. Deputy Marshal, Mrs. Caldwell, and 12 other residents were arrested on charges ranging from burglary and identity theft to conspiracy and fraud. They'd been running this scheme for over 15 years, targeting people like me who were isolated, vulnerable, and looking for a fresh start. The FBI found evidence linking them to the deaths of at least 3 previous victims who had gotten too close to discovering the truth. The scariest part wasn't the drugs or the theft or even the keys to my house. It was how perfectly they'd created the illusion of a welcoming small-town community. Every smile, every casserole, every friendly conversation was calculated to make me trust them while they systematically violated my privacy and stole my life savings. They had turned the very thing I was seeking: community, belonging, safety, into a weapon against me. I still have nightmares about Mrs. Caldwell's smile and the way she watched me take that first bite of her tuna noodle casserole, knowing exactly what she was doing to me. I never did find that peaceful small-town life I was looking for. Instead, I learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who offer you exactly what you think you need, with a smile and a homemade pie. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even in places that look like paradise. Especially in places that look like paradise. My name is Jaden, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2019 when I was 19 years old. I was home from college in Missoula, working a part-time job at KPNR 89.7 FM in Pine Ridge, Montana. Pine Ridge was one of those mountain logging towns with about 1,200 people, surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by Highway 2 and a couple of winding mountain roads. The radio station was housed in a small brick building on Main Street, right between Murphy's Hardware and the post office. It was a typical small-town operation. We played classic rock during the day, country in the evenings, and had a few local talk shows. Nothing fancy, just serving the community with music, weather updates, and local news. I worked the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., mostly playing automated programming and monitoring the equipment. The job was perfect for me because I could study between breaks and the pay was decent for a college kid. My supervisor, Dale Whitmore, was a 30-year veteran of radio who'd worked at stations across Montana before settling in Pine Ridge. He taught me everything about operating the transmitter, maintaining the emergency broadcast system, and following FCC regulations. Dale was the kind of guy who took radio seriously. He'd served in the Army Signal Corps and believed our little station was a vital community service, especially during emergencies in such an isolated area. The first weird incident happened about 3 weeks into my employment. I was alone in the studio around 2 a.m. when the emergency alert system activated on its own. The familiar harsh tone filled the booth, followed by the automated voice stating, "This is a test of the emergency alert system." But then something strange happened. Instead of the usual test message, a different voice came through, older and gravelly, like someone speaking through a poor quality microphone. The voice said, "Margaret Henley will die tomorrow at 4:17 p.m. on Old Mill Road. Vehicle accident. Prepare accordingly." Then it cut to dead air for exactly 10 seconds before our regular programming resumed. I immediately called Dale at home, thinking there must be some malfunction with the EAS equipment. He drove in within 20 minutes, still wearing his pajamas and looking concerned. We spent the next hour going through every piece of equipment, checking connections, running diagnostics, and examining the EAS logs. According to the computer, no emergency alert had been activated. The log showed continuous normal programming from 1:45 a.m. to 2:30 a.m., with no interruptions. Dale made me write down exactly what I'd heard and told me to report any similar incidents immediately. He seemed genuinely puzzled and mentioned that the EAS system was only 3 years old and had never malfunctioned before. The next day, Margaret Henley, a 67-year-old retired teacher, died in a single-vehicle accident on Old Mill Road at 4:17 p.m. Her car had gone off the road and hit a tree. The Yacha sheriff's report later stated she'd apparently fallen asleep at the wheel. When I heard about it on the local news that evening, I felt sick to my stomach. I called Dale immediately and told him about the connection. He was quiet for a long time before telling me not to mention this to anyone else, and that we'd discuss it when he came in the next morning. Dale arrived early the next day, with a grim expression and a stack of old files. He explained that similar incidents had occurred sporadically over the past 15 years at KPNR, but always during the overnight shift and always with different employees. The previous overnight DJ, a guy named Tommy Carson, had reported 3 separate incidents of unauthorized emergency broadcasts that predicted local deaths with disturbing accuracy. Tommy had quit abruptly 2 months before I was hired, and Dale admitted he'd hoped the problem had resolved itself. According to the files, every prediction had come true within 24 to 48 hours, always involving local residents and always describing the exact cause and approximate time of death. We decided to set up additional recording equipment to capture any future incidents. Dale installed a secondary digital recorder that would run continuously during my shifts, separate from the main broadcast equipment. He also gave me a notebook to log every detail of anything unusual, including exact times, weather conditions, and what songs were playing before and after any incidents. We agreed that if we could gather enough evidence, we'd contact the FCC or possibly the FBI, though Dale worried they'd think we were either lying or crazy. The second incident happened 6 days later. At 3:22 a.m., during a commercial break for Peterson's Auto Parts, the same harsh emergency tone interrupted the broadcast. This time the voice was different, younger, clearer, like someone speaking through a newer microphone. It said, "James Kowalski will die Thursday morning at 8:45 a.m. in his barn. Heart attack during morning chores. He will not be found until Friday evening." The message lasted exactly 15 seconds before cutting to our regular programming. I immediately started the backup recorder and documented everything in the notebook Dale had given me. James Kowalski was a local dairy farmer in his 60s who lived about 5 miles outside town. On Thursday morning, he didn't show up at Murphy's Hardware for his usual coffee, which people noticed because James had been coming in every morning for over 20 years. By Friday evening, when he still hadn't been seen, his neighbor went to check on him. They found James dead in his barn, apparently from a heart attack while feeding his cattle. The coroner estimated the time of death at approximately 8:45 a.m. Thursday morning, exactly as the mysterious broadcast had predicted. As word of James's death spread through town, I started noticing people looking at me differently when I walked down Main Street. Pine Ridge was small enough that everyone knew I worked the overnight shift at the radio station. And apparently some people had heard rumors about strange broadcasts. Mrs. Peterson from the auto parts store asked me directly if I'd heard anything unusual on the radio lately. When I tried to play dumb, she mentioned that her husband had been driving home from Kalispell Wednesday night and thought he'd heard something weird on KPNR around 3 a.m., but couldn't quite remember what it was. The third incident was the most disturbing. At 1:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in early August, the emergency tone activated during a Lynyrd Skynyrd song. This time, the voice sounded like a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, speaking in a sing-song rhythm that made my skin crawl. The message was, "Rebecca Santos will die Saturday afternoon at Miller's Pond. She will drown while swimming with friends. The water is deeper than it looks." After the 15-second message, the broadcast returned to the guitar solo in Free Bird, as if nothing had happened. Rebecca Santos was a 16-year-old high school student, daughter of the family that ran Santos Market on Main Street. I knew her family well because I bought groceries there, and the thought of that sweet kid drowning filled me with panic. This time, I couldn't just document and wait. I wrestled with what to do for 2 days before finally calling the Santos family on Friday morning. I told Mrs. Santos that I'd heard there might be dangerous conditions at Miller's Pond over the weekend, and suggested they warn Rebecca to be careful around water. Mrs. Santos thanked me, but seemed confused about why I was calling. Saturday afternoon, Rebecca and 3 friends went swimming at Miller's Pond, a popular local swimming hole fed by mountain runoff. According to the police report, Rebecca had been diving from the usual jumping spot when she apparently became disoriented underwater. The pond was deeper than most people realized due to recent heavy rains, and the cold mountain water had created unexpected currents. Her friends found her 20 minutes later, but it was too late. She drowned at Miller's Pond on Saturday afternoon, exactly as the broadcast had predicted, despite my attempt to prevent it. After Rebecca's death, I couldn't sleep and could barely function during my shifts. The idea that I was somehow receiving advance notice of people's deaths, but couldn't do anything to prevent them, was destroying me mentally. Dale and I had hours of recorded evidence by now, but it felt useless. We'd captured proof that something impossible was happening, but we couldn't save anyone. Dale suggested we contact the families directly before future incidents. But we both knew how insane we'd sound, trying to explain that supernatural radio broadcasts were predicting deaths in Pine Ridge. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. At 2:33 a.m. on a Thursday, the emergency system activated during the weather report. The voice this time sounded exactly like Dale Whitmore, using his professional radio delivery and cadence. It said, "Dale Whitmore will die Monday morning at 9:15 a.m. in the KPNR transmitter room. Electrical accident while performing routine maintenance. Equipment malfunction will cause fatal shock." The message was so clear and delivered in such a familiar voice that I initially thought Dale had somehow triggered it himself as a test, until I remembered he was home asleep. I called Dale immediately, waking him up to tell him about the broadcast. When I described hearing his own voice predicting his death, there was silence on the phone for almost a full minute. Finally, he told me to lock up the station and go home, and that he'd meet me there in the morning to figure out what to do next. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Dale arrived with his lawyer, his wife, and a resignation letter. He explained that he'd decided to quit immediately and was turning over all our evidence to the state police, the FCC, and whoever else would listen. Dale's plan was to avoid the transmitter room entirely until someone else could take over the technical operations of the station. But Monday morning, while we were meeting with a state police investigator in the main office, we heard a loud electrical pop from the transmitter room, followed by the smell of burning electronics. We found Dale's replacement, a technician named Gary Miller, who'd driven down from Kalispell, lying unconscious on the floor next to the main transmitter panel. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Gary had suffered massive electrical burns and died at the hospital 3 hours later at 11:47 a.m. The really disturbing part was that Gary Miller died in the exact location and from the exact cause that had been predicted for Dale, just with a different person and a slightly different time. It was like the broadcast had locked onto the event itself. Someone dying in that room from electrical shock, rather than the specific individual. This suggested that whatever was causing these predictions wasn't just random supernatural phenomena, but something that could somehow see or influence future events around the radio station itself. I quit that afternoon and drove straight back to Missoula without even packing my things from the apartment I'd been renting in Pine Ridge. Dale closed KPNR permanently the following week, citing equipment problems and staffing issues. The building now sits empty, and as far as I know, Pine Ridge has been without a local radio station ever since. I never found out if the mysterious broadcasts stopped when the station went off the air, or if they continued on dead frequencies that nobody was monitoring. To this day, I can't listen to emergency alert tests without getting panic attacks. I changed my major from communications to accounting and never worked in radio again. Sometimes I wonder if we should have tried harder to warn people, or if we should have kept the station running to monitor whatever was causing the broadcasts. But mostly, I try not to think about those voices that somehow knew exactly when and how people in Pine Ridge were going to die, and why they chose our little radio station to share their impossible knowledge with the world. My name is Janet, and I need to tell you about something that happened in Clearwater, Arkansas that still haunts me 15 years later. I was 30 years old then, working as a school bus driver for Clearwater County Schools, and I thought I was helping kids get safely to and from school every day. Clearwater was a small rural community near the Ozarks with about 900 people, mostly farming families scattered across the hills and hollers connected by winding gravel roads. I drove Route 7, which covered the most remote areas, places where kids might live 5 or 10 miles from their nearest neighbor. And the school bus was their only reliable connection to the outside world. I'd been driving bus for 3 years when I started noticing irregularities in my student count and attendance records. My route was supposed to serve 47 students from kindergarten through 12th grade. But some days, I'd have kids on my list who never showed up, and other days, I'd have kids whose names I couldn't find on any roster. When I asked the transportation supervisor, Mrs. Bradley, about these discrepancies, she'd always have an explanation. Kids moved away suddenly, or families decided to homeschool, or there were clerical errors in the computer system. She assured me that everything was being handled properly by the main office and that I shouldn't worry about paperwork issues. The first time I really knew something was wrong was in October 2008. When a little girl named Emma Caldwell stopped riding my bus. Emma was 7 years old, lived with her grandmother in a trailer on Possum Creek Road, and had been one of my regular riders since the school year started. She was quiet, always sat in the third seat on the right side, and carried the same faded pink backpack every day. One Tuesday morning, Emma wasn't at her usual stop. When I asked other kids on the bus if they knew where she was, they just shrugged and said they hadn't seen her. I reported her absence to Mrs. Bradley, who told me Emma's grandmother had decided to homeschool her and forgot to notify transportation. But something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. Emma's grandmother, Ruth Caldwell, was in her 70s and could barely read, according to what Emma had mentioned during our conversations. The idea that Ruth would suddenly decide to homeschool a 7-year-old seemed impossible. I decided to drive by their trailer that weekend to check on them, using the excuse that Emma had left something on the bus. When I got to Possum Creek Road, the trailer was empty. No cars, no furniture visible through the windows, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. The neighbor, an old man named Henry Tucker, told me the Caldwells had moved away, sudden-like, in the middle of the night, about a week earlier. But he didn't know where they'd gone. Over the next few months, similar disappearances happened with increasing frequency. Kids would stop riding the bus with various explanations from the office. Families moving, switching to homeschooling, or transferring to private schools. But when I tried to follow up or say goodbye to kids I'd grown fond of, I'd find empty houses, disconnected phone numbers, or neighbors who said the families had left without warning. By Christmas, I'd lost 8 regular riders under circumstances that made no sense. These were poor rural families who'd lived in the area for generations, not the type of people who could afford to pick up and move on a whim, and certainly not the type who could afford private school tuition. The breaking point came in February 2009 with a boy named Tyler Morrison. Tyler was 14, lived with his single mother in a rundown house on Highway 412, and was one of the few kids who talked to me regularly. He was a good kid despite his rough circumstances. His mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home, so Tyler took care of himself and helped watch younger kids in the neighborhood. One morning, Tyler got on the bus with a black eye and bruises on his neck. When I asked if he was okay, he said he'd gotten into a fight. but he seemed scared rather than angry. That afternoon, Tyler wasn't at his stop for the ride home. I called the school immediately and was transferred to the principal, Mr. Davidson. He told me Tyler had been suspended for fighting and would be out for the rest of the week. But when I asked about the bruises and whether someone had checked on Tyler's welfare, Mr. Davidson became irritated and told me to stick to driving and leave student discipline to the administrators. The next Monday, Mrs. Bradley informed me that Tyler had been withdrawn from school permanently due to family circumstances, and that his name had been removed from my route roster. Something about Tyler's situation felt different from the others. He was older, more visible in the community, and had mentioned wanting to graduate and join the military. The idea that he'd just disappear without a word seemed impossible. I drove to his house that evening and found it dark and empty, just like all the others. But this time, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Tyler's bicycle was still chained to the front porch, and his backpack was sitting on the steps like he'd just gotten home from school. No teenager leaves without their bike and backpack, especially not one planning a permanent move with his family. I started keeping my own detailed records of every student who rode my bus, including their addresses, family situations, and the dates they stopped riding. I took photos of the empty houses and trailers where these families had supposedly moved away from. I began timing my routes more carefully and noticed that certain administrators would sometimes be waiting at remote stops where kids had recently disappeared, even though there was no official reason for them to be in those locations. Mr. Davidson and the assistant principal, Mrs. Cooper, seemed to have an unusual interest in the most isolated children on my route, the ones from the poorest families, with the least community connections. The pattern became clear once I started documenting everything systematically. The children who disappeared were always from families that fit a specific profile: single parents or elderly guardians, extreme poverty, social isolation, no extended family in the area, and often some kind of existing conflict with local authorities. These were kids that the community might not immediately miss, families that neighbors might assume had good reasons for leaving suddenly. They were also children who regularly rode my bus alone to remote stops where no one else would witness what happened to them. In March 2009, I decided to follow the bus route in my personal car one afternoon, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to see what happened at each stop. What I witnessed at the Morrison property where Tyler had lived made my blood run cold. Mr. Davidson was there with two men I didn't recognize, loading what appeared to be furniture and personal belongings into a large truck. They worked quickly and efficiently, like they'd done this many times before. When they finished, one of the men poured gasoline around the foundation of the house and lit it on fire. Within an hour, there was no evidence that the Morrison family had ever lived there. I realized I was witnessing the systematic erasure of families and children from our community, orchestrated by people I'd trusted to protect those same children. The school administration wasn't just covering up disappearances. They were actively facilitating them. I had no idea what was happening to these families, but I knew it wasn't voluntary relocation or homeschooling arrangements. These people were being removed from the community permanently, and their very existence was being wiped out to prevent anyone from asking questions. The next morning, I called the Arkansas State Police and reported everything I'd observed and documented. The detective I spoke with, Detective Martinez, took my statement seriously and asked me to continue my normal routine while they investigated. Within a week, I was contacted by FBI agents who explained that they'd been tracking reports of missing children in rural Arkansas communities, but had never had someone with direct access to school transportation records and detailed observations. They asked me to continue documenting incidents while wearing a wire to record conversations with school administrators. The investigation that followed revealed a trafficking network that had been operating in rural Arkansas for over a decade. Mr. Davidson, Mrs. Cooper, and several other school officials had been identifying vulnerable children and families, then arranging for their removal and sale to buyers across the country. They used their positions in the school system to identify targets, manipulate records to explain absences, and coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure no investigations occurred. The empty houses and destroyed evidence were part of an elaborate cover-up designed to make it look like families had simply moved away. Over 30 families had been victimized over the years, including every child I'd documented as missing from my bus route. Some had been killed when they resisted or tried to escape, while others had been sold into various forms of forced labor and exploitation. The investigation expanded to include similar operations in 5 other rural Arkansas counties, all using school transportation systems to identify and access vulnerable children in isolated areas. Mr. Davidson and Mrs. Cooper were both sentenced to life in prison without parole. Mrs. Bradley, the transportation supervisor, received 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. Several local law enforcement officers and social services workers were also convicted for their participation in the cover-up. The FBI recovered some of the victims, including Tyler Morrison, who had been held at a compound in Texas for over a year. Emma Caldwell and her grandmother were found at a farm in Oklahoma, where they'd been forced to work without pay since their disappearance. I quit driving school bus immediately after the trials and now work at the grocery store in Clearwater. I can't bring myself to be around children in a professional capacity anymore, knowing how badly I failed to protect the ones who trusted me. Every time I see a school bus, I think about all those empty seats and wonder how many other communities have people in positions of authority who are supposed to protect children, but are actually predators. The scariest part wasn't the disappearances themselves. It was how easily the system allowed it to happen, and how many adults in positions of trust were either participating or choosing to look the other way. Those children depended on all of us, and we let them down in the worst possible way. My name is Amir, and I need to tell you about what I witnessed during my time working night security at St. Catherine's Medical Center in St. Catharines Falls, New Mexico. This was back in 2017 when I was 34 years old, recently divorced, and desperate for steady work with decent benefits. St. Catharines Falls was a desert town of about 3,000 people, built around the military base and the regional medical center that served patients from across southeastern New Mexico. The hospital was modern, well-funded, and had a reputation for excellent care, which is why I thought I'd landed a good job when they hired me for the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. security shift. St. Catharines Medical Center was a sprawling complex with 4 main wings connected by underground tunnels and sky bridges. My job was straightforward, according to the orientation materials. Patrol the premises every 2 hours, monitor the security cameras, check access points, and maintain logs of any incidents or unusual activities. The pay was decent at $18 an hour, and the night differential brought it up to over $21. I was told that night shifts were generally quiet since most departments shut down after 10 p.m., except for emergency services, the intensive care unit, and a skeleton crew of nurses and maintenance staff. During my first week, everything seemed normal. I'd make my rounds through the main hospital corridors, check the parking areas, verify that all restricted access doors were secure, and spend most of my time in the security office monitoring feeds from 47 cameras positioned throughout the facility. The night supervisor, Maria Santos, was a 15-year veteran who showed me the ropes and emphasized the importance of detailed documentation for insurance and liability purposes. She explained that the night shift security guard was often the only witness to incidents, so accurate records were crucial. The first sign that something wasn't right came during my second week, when I noticed unusual activity in Wing D, which housed the extended care facility for long-term patients. According to my briefing materials, Wing D should have been mostly empty at night, except for a few permanent residents who required round-the-clock care. But on multiple occasions, around 2 a.m., I observed medical staff wheeling patients down the corridors toward the service elevators that led to the basement levels. When I asked Maria about this, she explained that some patients required specialized treatments that were scheduled during off hours to avoid disrupting normal hospital operations. What bothered me was the way these midnight transfers were conducted. The staff involved always wore surgical masks and caps that completely obscured their faces, even though standard hospital protocols didn't require such extensive protective equipment for routine patient transport. The patients being moved appeared to be sedated or unconscious, and I never saw any of them return to their rooms during my subsequent rounds. When I checked the patient logs for Wing D, many of the rooms that I'd seen patients removed from were listed as vacant the next day. My suspicions deepened when I started paying closer attention to the basement levels during my patrols. The hospital's basement housed the morgue, pathology labs, medical record storage, and mechanical rooms for the building's infrastructure. Access to these areas required special key cards, but as security, I had master access for emergency purposes. During routine checks, I began noticing that certain rooms in the basement were being used outside of normal hours, with equipment running and lights on well past the times when those departments should have been closed. The breakthrough came when I discovered that one of the basement rooms, officially listed as Storage Room B47 on the hospital blueprints, was actually a fully equipped surgical suite. I found this during a security check when I heard the distinctive sounds of medical equipment, heart monitors, ventilators, and surgical tools. When I used my key card to investigate, I found a sterile operating room with state-of-the-art equipment that wasn't listed on any hospital inventory I'd seen. The room was empty when I entered, but it was clear that surgery had been performed recently based on the blood traces and used surgical instruments in the sterilization area. I started documenting everything I observed during my night shifts, taking photos with my personal phone and keeping detailed notes about times, locations, and the staff members involved. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Patients were being selected from Wing D's long-term care population. People who were elderly, had no regular visitors, or suffered from conditions that made them unlikely to be missed immediately. These patients were being taken to the unauthorized surgical suite in the basement where medical procedures were being performed without proper documentation or oversight. The most horrifying discovery came when I gained access to a restricted area of the basement that wasn't on any official hospital map. Following a service corridor that led past the morgue, I found a section of rooms that had been converted into what could only be described as holding cells. These rooms contained hospital beds with restraints, basic life support equipment, and no windows or external access. Each room held 1 or 2 patients who appeared to be heavily sedated and connected to monitoring equipment. The patients looked like they'd undergone recent surgical procedures based on the bandages and surgical sites visible on their bodies. I realized I was looking at some kind of illegal medical experimentation facility operating within the hospital. The patients being held appeared to be test subjects for unauthorized procedures, likely organ harvesting or experimental treatments that would never be approved through legitimate medical channels. The staff involved included several doctors and nurses I recognized from the regular day shift. But they were operating completely outside the hospital's official protocols and without any regulatory oversight. The scope of the operation became clear when I discovered the record-keeping system they used. Hidden in a maintenance room, I found filing cabinets containing detailed medical records for hundreds of patients who had been subjected to various experimental procedures over the past several years. The records showed systematic organ removal, testing of experimental drugs and surgical procedures that were designed to study the effects of various medical interventions on human subjects. Many of the files ended with death certificates that listed causes of death as natural complications from existing medical conditions. What made this operation particularly sinister was how it exploited the hospital's legitimate medical infrastructure and reputation. St. Catherine's Medical Center was respected throughout the region, and families trusted their loved ones to receive proper care there. The long-term care patients in Wing D were perfect victims because they were already isolated from their families, had complex medical conditions that could explain deterioration or death, and were dependent on the hospital staff for all their basic needs. The experimental procedures were being disguised as routine medical care, and deaths were being attributed to the progression of existing illnesses. I also discovered that this operation had connections beyond the hospital itself. The records indicated that some of the harvested organs were being sold to medical facilities in other states, while experimental data was being provided to pharmaceutical companies and medical research organizations. The money generated from these illegal activities was being used to fund the unauthorized facility and provide substantial payments to the staff members involved in the conspiracy. The breaking point came when I witnessed them preparing to operate on a patient I recognized, an elderly man named George Ramirez, who had been admitted to Wing D for recovery after a stroke. George's daughter visited him regularly, and I knew she was planning to transfer him to a facility closer to her home in Albuquerque. That night, I watched as they wheeled George to the basement surgical suite, and I knew I had to act immediately to prevent them from making him their next victim. I called the FBI from my car in the hospital parking lot and reported everything I discovered and documented over the past 2 months. The agent I spoke with, Agent Thompson, initially seemed skeptical until I described the specific details of the unauthorized surgical suite in the patient holding area. She arranged for me to meet with a task force that had been investigating reports of medical fraud and illegal organ trafficking in the Southwest. My evidence provided the breakthrough they needed to obtain search warrants and launch a full investigation. The raid on St. Catherine's Medical Center happened 3 days later during the early morning hours when the illegal operations were typically in progress. Federal agents arrested 14 hospital staff members, including 2 doctors, 6 nurses, and several administrators who had been facilitating the conspiracy. They rescued 12 patients who were being held in the basement facility, including George Ramirez, who survived his ordeal and was eventually reunited with his family. The investigation revealed that this illegal medical experimentation network had been operating for over 8 years and had victimized more than 300 patients during that time. The conspiracy included hospital administrators who altered patient records, pathologists who falsified death certificates, and financial staff who laundered the money generated from organ sales and experimental data. The federal prosecutor estimated that the network had generated over $15 million in illegal profits during its operation. I testified at the trials of all 14 defendants, and most received sentences ranging from 15 to 35 years in federal prison. St. Catherine's Medical Center was shut down permanently, and the building now sits empty in the desert. The state of New Mexico implemented new oversight procedures for medical facilities, but I know that similar operations could be happening at hospitals anywhere in the country. The scariest part wasn't the illegal surgeries or even the deaths. It was how easily a trusted medical institution could be corrupted and used to prey on the most vulnerable patients who had nowhere else to turn for care. I moved to Colorado after the trials and now work in private security for office buildings. I can't bring myself to work in healthcare facilities anymore, and I have trouble trusting doctors or hospitals even for routine medical care. Every time I hear about unexplained deaths at medical facilities or patients who deteriorate unexpectedly during hospital stays, I wonder if there are other night shift security guards out there who are seeing things they don't understand and not speaking up about them. My name is Amy, and I need to tell you about growing up in Covenant Hills, Tennessee, an isolated mountain community of about 300 people, where my father, Pastor Thomas Sterling, led the Church of Divine Purification. I was 23 when I finally escaped in 2015, but it took me years to fully understand the horror of what I witnessed during my childhood and teenage years in that remote valley tucked deep in the Cumberland Mountains. Covenant Hills wasn't just a small town. It was a closed religious community where every aspect of daily life was controlled by the church elders, and where questioning doctrine or attempting to leave could result in what they called purification ceremonies. The Church of Divine Purification had been established in Covenant Hills in 1987 by my father and two other ministers who claimed to have received direct revelations from God about the approaching end times. They taught that mainstream Christianity had become corrupted by modern society, and that only through complete separation from the outside world and absolute obedience to church authority could believers achieve salvation. The entire community was built around the church complex, which included the main sanctuary, administrative buildings, a school for the children, and most importantly, the basement levels where the real business of the church took place. From earliest childhood, I was taught that the outside world was filled with demons, and that leaving Covenant Hills would result in eternal damnation. We had no television, no internet, no newspapers, and limited contact with anyone who wasn't part of our community. The few times strangers came to town, usually government officials or utility workers, we were instructed to avoid contact and report any conversations to the church elders immediately. My father preached that we were God's chosen remnant, and that our isolation and obedience would protect us when the apocalypse came to destroy the rest of humanity. The first time I realized something was deeply wrong was when I was 8 years old and witnessed what happened to Sister Margaret Hawkins, a 45-year-old woman who had questioned my father's interpretation of certain Bible verses during a Sunday service. That evening, Brother Samuel and Brother David, two of the church deacons, came to the Hawkins family home and escorted Margaret to the church basement for what they called spiritual counseling. I followed them, hiding behind the wooden pews in the sanctuary above, and listened through the ventilation system as Margaret's questioning turned to pleading, then to screaming, then to silence. The basement of our church contained several rooms that were off limits to most congregation members, including children. There was a prayer room with thick stone walls and no windows, a meditation chamber equipped with restraints and medical equipment, and what my father called the purification sanctuary, where serious violations of church doctrine were addressed through physical correction. The church taught that suffering was necessary for spiritual growth, and that pain inflicted in service to God was actually an act of love that would help purify the soul of the sinner. Over the years, I witnessed dozens of people subjected to these purification ceremonies for various infractions, speaking to outsiders, questioning church teachings, attempting to leave the community, or showing insufficient enthusiasm during worship services could all result in basement sessions that lasted anywhere from hours to several days. The victims would emerge broken, traumatized, and completely compliant with whatever the church demanded. Those who didn't emerge at all were said to have been called home to glory and were buried in the church cemetery with sermons about their peaceful transition to heaven. The systematic abuse reached its peak during what my father called the Great Purification in the summer of 2012. He had received what he claimed was a divine revelation that certain members of the congregation were harboring demonic influences that threatened the entire community. Over a period of 3 months, 17 people were subjected to increasingly violent purification ceremonies designed to drive out these supposed evil spirits. The basement became a torture chamber where church members were beaten, starved, subjected to mock crucifixions, and forced to confess to sins they hadn't committed. The most horrifying aspect was how the community rationalized and participated in this abuse. Church members were required to take turns assisting with the purification ceremonies, which meant that parents helped torture other people's children. Neighbors participated in the abuse of their friends, and everyone became complicit in the systematic brutalization of anyone who showed the slightest sign of independent thinking. The church taught that refusing to participate in purification work was itself a sin that would require correction. So people who might have objected were forced to choose between becoming victims themselves or helping victimize others. I knew I had to escape when my father announced that I had been chosen for a special purification on my 21st birthday. He claimed that God had revealed to him that I was destined to become a vessel for demonic forces unless I underwent an intensive cleansing ritual that would involve days of physical and spiritual correction in the basement chambers. The ceremony was scheduled for the week after my birthday, and I realized that I would either die during the process or emerge so broken that I would never be able to think clearly enough to escape again. My opportunity came during the Harvest Festival in October 2015, when most of the community was gathered in the main hall for evening celebrations. I had been preparing for months by hiding supplies and studying the mountain trails that led away from Covenant Hills, using a path that hunters had shown me. Years earlier, I was able to slip away from the festivities and hike 15 miles through the forest to the nearest town with a bus station. The entire journey took me over 8 hours through dangerous mountain terrain in the dark. But I knew that being caught meant certain death in my father's purification chambers. When I reached the outside world, I had no identification, no money, no understanding of how modern society functioned, and no way to explain what I had escaped from without sounding completely insane. I lived in shelters and worked minimum-wage jobs while slowly learning how to navigate life outside the isolated religious community where I'd spent my entire life. It took years of therapy and education to fully understand that what I had experienced wasn't legitimate religious practice, but systematic cult abuse designed to maintain absolute control over every aspect of people's lives. The breaking point for Covenant Hills came in 2018 when one of the church members, Brother Michael Patterson, managed to escape and contact federal authorities about the ongoing abuse and the suspicious deaths that had occurred over the years. The FBI investigation that followed revealed evidence of at least 23 murders disguised as natural deaths or religious ceremonies, along with decades of child abuse, forced labor, and financial fraud perpetrated by the church leadership. Federal agents found torture devices in the church basement, mass graves in the community cemetery, and detailed records of the purification ceremonies kept by my father and the other elders. My father and 6 other church leaders were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, child abuse, and running a criminal enterprise. The trials revealed the full scope of the horror that had been occurring in Covenant Hills for nearly 30 years. Survivors testified about forced marriages between adult men and children, medical neglect that resulted in preventable deaths, and systematic psychological abuse designed to break down individual identity and critical thinking abilities. The prosecution presented evidence that the Church of Divine Purification had operated more like a criminal organization than a religious institution. The most disturbing revelation was the discovery of financial records showing that my father and the other leaders had been stealing from church members while living comfortable lives funded by the forced labor and property seizures of their followers. The religious ideology and claims about divine revelation had been a facade covering a sophisticated fraud operation that exploited people's spiritual beliefs to maintain control and generate profit. The purification ceremonies weren't religious rituals, but torture sessions designed to terrorize the community into absolute compliance. All 7 church leaders received life sentences, without the possibility of parole. The Covenant Hills community was dissolved, and the surviving members were provided with counseling and assistance to integrate into mainstream society. Many of them struggled with the transition, having spent decades in an environment where every decision was made for them, and independent thinking was literally beaten out of them. Some never fully recovered from the trauma and spent the rest of their lives in assisted care facilities. I now work as a counselor specializing in cult survivors and religious trauma, trying to help other people who have escaped similar situations. The hardest part of my work is explaining to people that religious freedom doesn't mean the right to torture and murder people in the name of God, and that legitimate spiritual communities don't require absolute isolation from the outside world or unquestioning obedience to human leaders. What happened in Covenant Hills wasn't aberrant religious practice. It was organized crime using religious language to justify systematic abuse and murder. The scariest realization for me was understanding how easily ordinary people can be manipulated into participating in horrific abuse when it's presented as religious duty or spiritual necessity. The people who tortured me and others in that church basement weren't monsters. They were parents, neighbors, and friends who had been gradually conditioned to believe that inflicting suffering was an act of love and obedience to God. That's the real horror of places like Covenant Hills. Not that evil people do evil things, but that good people can be systematically corrupted into becoming willing participants in the torture and murder of their own community members. My name is Stephen, and I need to tell you about what happened at Riverside Mills Paper Company in Riverside Mills, Wisconsin, during my time as a night shift supervisor from 2014 to 2017. Riverside Mills was a company town of about 800 people on the shores of Lake Superior, built entirely around the paper mill that had been operating since 1923. The mill employed nearly half the town's residents and had been passed down through generations. Fathers worked alongside sons, and families had been connected to the mill for decades. I was 49 years old when I started there, a 25-year veteran of paper mill operations who had worked at facilities across Wisconsin and Minnesota before taking the supervisor position on the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The Riverside Mills facility was typical of the older paper mills that dotted Wisconsin's industrial landscape. Massive machinery housed in brick buildings that stretched along the shoreline, with steam rising constantly from the pulp digesters and the rhythmic pounding of the paper machines, creating a soundtrack that never stopped. We manufactured newsprint and lightweight printing paper, using a process that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. The night shift crew consisted of 12 workers operating the paper machines, pulp preparation equipment, and the finishing department where the massive paper rolls were cut and prepared for shipping. My job as night supervisor involved overseeing production quotas, ensuring safety compliance, and coordinating maintenance schedules with the day shift management. The work was dangerous. Paper mills are filled with heavy machinery, caustic chemicals, high-pressure steam systems, and equipment that can kill you in seconds if you're not paying attention. We had strict OSHA protocols for everything from lockout-tagout procedures to confined space entry. And I took safety seriously because I'd seen too many mill accidents during my career. What I didn't expect was that some of the most dangerous situations we faced wouldn't be from the machinery itself. The first incident that made me question what was happening at Riverside Mills occurred in January 2015, about 6 months after I'd started working there. Tommy Kowalski, a 34-year-old machine tender with 8 years of experience, was found dead in the basement level near the old No. 3 paper machine that had been shut down for maintenance. The official cause of death was listed as accidental electrocution from a faulty control panel. But several things about Tommy's death didn't make sense to me. First, that particular machine had been completely powered down and locked out for 3 days, with all electrical connections verified as de-energized. Second, Tommy had no reason to be in that area of the basement during his shift. His assigned duties were on the main floor with the active equipment. What bothered me most was Tommy's condition when we found him. He appeared to have been trying to warn someone about something. His hand was outstretched toward the stairwell leading to the main floor, and there were scratch marks on his arms like he'd been clawing at something or trying to escape from someone. The company's accident investigation team, led by Corporate Safety Director Margaret Webb, concluded that Tommy had violated safety protocols by entering the lockout area alone and had somehow contacted live electrical equipment despite the shutdown procedures. The investigation was closed within a week, and Tommy's family received a standard workers' compensation settlement along with instructions not to discuss the incident publicly. 2 months later, we lost another worker under similarly suspicious circumstances. Rita Sanderson, a 42-year-old quality control technician, was found dead in the chemical storage area during her morning rounds. The official report stated that she had been overcome by chlorine dioxide fumes from a leaking storage tank. But I knew Rita had 15 years of experience working with mill chemicals and always followed proper respiratory protection procedures. When I examined the area after the incident, I noticed that Rita's gas monitor, a device that should have alerted her to dangerous chemical concentrations, was missing from her body. These monitors were expensive pieces of safety equipment that workers were required to wear at all times in chemical areas, and it seemed impossible that Rita would have removed hers voluntarily. The pattern continued throughout 2015 and into 2016. Workers died in what were officially classified as preventable accidents caused by safety violations or equipment failures. But each incident involved experienced employees who knew better than to take the risks that supposedly killed them. Jake Morrison was crushed by a paper roll that accidentally fell from a crane, even though the crane operator swore he hadn't been operating the equipment at the time. Maria Santos was found dead in a steam tunnel with burns consistent with high-pressure steam exposure, despite the fact that the steam systems in that area had been shut down for scheduled maintenance. Every investigation followed the same pattern: quick conclusions, family settlements with non-disclosure agreements, and corporate emphasis on preventing similar accidents through additional safety training. I started documenting everything I observed about these deaths, including photographs of the accident scenes, copies of maintenance records, and detailed notes about the circumstances surrounding each incident. What emerged was a disturbing pattern suggesting that these weren't random industrial accidents, but targeted killings designed to look like workplace mishaps. The victims all shared certain characteristics. They were older, experienced workers who had been with the company for many years and would have been eligible for significant pension benefits upon retirement. They were also workers who had access to sensitive areas of the plant and detailed knowledge of mill operations that could be valuable to competitors or regulatory investigators. The breakthrough in understanding what was really happening came when I started experiencing supernatural encounters that seemed connected to the dead workers. The first incident occurred in March 2016, while I was conducting my routine safety inspection of the basement areas. As I approached the location where Tommy Kowalski had died, I heard his voice clearly warning me to stay away from Webb and her people. When I turned around, I saw Tommy standing near the old No. 3 paper machine, looking exactly as he had when he was alive, but with obvious electrical burn marks on his hands and face. He repeated his warning about Margaret Webb before disappearing. Over the following months, I encountered the spirits of other workers who had died at the mill. Rita Sanderson appeared to me in the chemical storage area, showing me a hidden camera that had been installed to monitor workers in that section. Jake Morrison's ghost led me to evidence that the crane accident had been caused by someone remotely operating the equipment from a control panel in the maintenance office. Maria Santos showed me documentation proving that the steam systems had been deliberately reactivated to kill her while she was conducting her rounds. Each encounter provided information about how these workers had been murdered and who was responsible for covering up the crimes. The supernatural encounters weren't limited to me. Other night shift workers started reporting similar experiences, and it became clear that the spirits of our dead colleagues were trying to communicate information about their murders. The ghost of Tommy Kowalski appeared to multiple workers, always delivering the same warning about not trusting Margaret Webb and the corporate safety team. Rita Sanderson's spirit showed several people the hidden surveillance equipment that had been installed throughout the mill without worker knowledge. The pattern suggested that these ghosts were actively working to expose the conspiracy that had led to their deaths. The most disturbing revelation came when I realized the scope of what was happening. Using information provided by the spirits and my own investigation, I discovered that Riverside Mills was being systematically stripped of its most valuable assets before being sold to a Chinese manufacturing conglomerate. The experienced workers who were being killed possessed institutional knowledge about mill operations, maintenance procedures, and production secrets that would be worth millions of dollars to competitors. By eliminating these workers and making their deaths look accidental, the corporate management could transfer this knowledge to the new owners while avoiding pension obligations and potential whistleblower problems. Margaret Webb wasn't just a safety director. She was coordinating a sophisticated murder operation designed to facilitate the sale of the mill while eliminating witnesses who could expose safety violations, environmental crimes, and financial fraud that had occurred over many years. The workers' compensation settlements and non-disclosure agreements were part of a cover-up designed to prevent families from asking questions or conducting independent investigations. The accidents were actually executions carried out by maintenance staff and security personnel who were being paid substantial bonuses for their participation. In September 2016, I made contact with an FBI agent who specialized in corporate crime and presented all the evidence I had gathered, including recordings of conversations with other workers who had witnessed supernatural encounters. Agent Patricia Coleman initially seemed skeptical about the ghost stories, but the physical evidence and documentation I provided about the suspicious deaths convinced her to launch a federal investigation. The supernatural encounters had led me to discover hidden surveillance equipment, falsified maintenance records, and financial documents that proved the systematic murder of mill workers. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full extent of the conspiracy at Riverside Mills. Margaret Webb and 6 other corporate employees were arrested for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. The investigation also uncovered evidence of environmental crimes, tax evasion, and worker safety violations that had been covered up for years. The Chinese conglomerate that had planned to purchase the mill withdrew their offer once the murders were exposed, and Riverside Mills was eventually shut down permanently. What made this case unique was the role that supernatural encounters played in solving the crimes. Without the warnings and guidance provided by the spirits of murdered workers, I never would have known where to look for evidence or understood the scope of the conspiracy. The ghosts of Tommy, Rita, Jake, Maria, and the others had returned to ensure that justice was served and that their murders wouldn't be dismissed as industrial accidents. Their supernatural intervention prevented additional killings and exposed a corporate crime network that had been operating for several years. I retired from mill work after the trials and now live in a small cabin in northern Minnesota, far from any industrial facilities. I still occasionally encounter the spirits of my former colleagues, but their appearances are peaceful now, rather than urgent warnings about danger. They seem satisfied that their murders were solved and that the people responsible were brought to justice. The scariest part of this experience wasn't the supernatural encounters. It was discovering how easily corporate executives could murder workers and make it look like routine industrial accidents, knowing that most people would never question the official explanations or look for evidence of foul play. The Riverside Mills case taught me that some of the most dangerous threats to workers come not from machinery or chemicals, but from management personnel who view human lives as disposable obstacles to profit maximization. The spirits of murdered workers returned because they knew that living people needed their help to expose crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden forever. Sometimes the dead are the only ones who can speak for justice, when the living are too frightened or corrupted to tell the truth. My name is Lisa, and I need to tell you about what I discovered during my 8 years working as a police dispatcher for the Crossroads Junction Sheriff's Department in Crossroads Junction, Kansas. Crossroads Junction was a truck stop town of about 650 people located at the intersection of Interstate 70 and State Highway 83, strategically positioned along one of the major east-west transportation corridors in the United States. The town existed primarily to serve long-haul truckers, with 3 major truck stops, several motels, and a handful of restaurants and gas stations clustered around the highway interchange. I was 31 years old when I started working dispatch in 2013, and I thought I was taking a straightforward job coordinating emergency services and maintaining communication with patrol units for a small, rural law enforcement agency. The Crossroads Junction Sheriff's Department was a small operation with Sheriff William Garrett, 2 full-time deputies, and several part-time officers who covered the county's 800 square miles of rural farmland and highway corridors. My job as the night dispatcher from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. involved answering emergency calls, coordinating responses with state and federal agencies, maintaining radio communication with patrol units, and logging all incidents and activities in the department's computer system. The work was generally routine. Domestic disputes, traffic accidents, drunk and disorderly calls from the truck stops, and occasional property crimes. What I didn't realize was that I was also documenting evidence of a systematic human trafficking operation that involved several members of the law enforcement agency I worked for. The first sign that something wasn't right was the unusual number of missing person reports we received involving transient individuals, mostly runaway teenagers, drifters, and undocumented immigrants who had been traveling through the area. These reports would come in from family members, social services agencies, or occasionally from truckers who had given someone a ride and were concerned when the person disappeared without explanation. What bothered me was how these reports were handled by the sheriff's department. Sheriff Garrett would typically assign these cases to Deputy Frank Morrison, who would conduct what appeared to be perfunctory investigations before closing the cases as left the area voluntarily or insufficient information to continue investigation. Over my first 2 years on the job, I logged 47 missing person reports involving transient individuals. But none of these cases ever resulted in the person being located or any meaningful investigative activity. Deputy Morrison's reports consistently followed the same pattern. Minimal interviews with potential witnesses, no follow-up with other law enforcement agencies, and quick case closures with standardized language about the person having likely moved on to another location. When I mentioned to Sheriff Garrett that we seemed to have an unusual number of missing person cases, he explained that Crossroads Junction's location on Interstate 70 made it a natural stopping point for people passing through, and that most of these individuals were simply continuing their travels without notifying anyone. The pattern became more disturbing when I started noticing correlations between the missing person reports and certain trucking activities logged in our dispatch records. Many of the people who disappeared had last been seen at specific truck stops or had been getting rides with particular trucking companies that regularly stopped in Crossroads Junction. When I cross-referenced the dates and times of disappearances with truck stop surveillance footage and driver logbooks that we occasionally obtained for other investigations, I found that several drivers and trucking companies appeared repeatedly in connection with missing person cases. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns that suggested systematic involvement in the disappearances. My suspicions deepened when I began monitoring radio communications more carefully and noticed that Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison frequently used coded language and informal communication channels when discussing certain cases. They would arrange to meet off radio to discuss sensitive matters, and I observed them having private conversations with truckers and truck stop managers that weren't documented in any official reports. During night shifts, when I was alone in the dispatch center, I started recording these conversations and maintaining my own detailed logs of suspicious activities that weren't being properly documented by the investigating officers. The breakthrough came in March 2015 when I intercepted a radio conversation between Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison that they apparently thought was on a secure channel. They were discussing a 16-year-old runaway named Jessica Martinez, who had been reported missing by her foster family in Colorado. Sheriff Garrett instructed Deputy Morrison to make contact with the regular buyer and arrange for Jessica to be processed through the usual route before her case attracted attention from state authorities. The conversation included specific references to truck license plates, cash payments, and coordination with contacts in Texas and Oklahoma who would handle the final placement. I realized I was listening to evidence of a human trafficking network that was using the Sheriff's Department's official authority to identify, capture, and sell vulnerable people to buyers across the region. The missing person reports weren't unsolved cases. They were business transactions where law enforcement officers were actively participating in the kidnapping and sale of human beings. The truck stops, motels, and highway access that made Crossroads Junction attractive to legitimate travelers also made it perfect for trafficking operations that could move victims quickly, across state lines and beyond the reach of local investigations. Over the following months, I systematically documented every aspect of the trafficking operation I could observe from my position in the dispatch center. I recorded radio conversations, photographed documents when I had access to Sheriff Garrett's office, and maintained detailed logs of the correlation between missing person reports and subsequent trafficking activities. The operation was sophisticated and had been running for years. With established procedures for identifying targets, coordinating with truckers who served as transporters, and laundering the money generated through the sale of victims to buyers in other states. The most horrifying aspect was understanding how the Sheriff's Department's legitimate law enforcement functions were being perverted to facilitate these crimes. When runaway teenagers or undocumented immigrants were arrested or encountered during routine patrols, Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison would evaluate them as potential trafficking victims rather than provide appropriate services or legal processing. Vulnerable individuals who should have been protected by law enforcement were instead being sold to the highest bidder, with their disappearances explained away as voluntary departures or cases where people simply moved on to other locations. I also discovered that the trafficking network extended beyond Crossroads Junction and involved law enforcement personnel in other rural Kansas counties along Interstate 70. The radio communications I monitored included coordination with sheriff's departments in Ellis County, Russell County, and Lincoln County, suggesting that this was a regional operation using multiple small-town law enforcement agencies to identify and process trafficking victims. The interstate highway system that connected these rural communities was being used as a pipeline for moving people who had been kidnapped and sold into various forms of forced labor and sexual exploitation. The financial scope of the operation became clear when I gained access to Sheriff Garrett's financial records during a period when he was out of town and had left sensitive documents in his unlocked office. The trafficking network was generating substantial profits. Individual victims were being sold for amounts ranging from $5,000 to $25,000, depending on their age, physical condition, and perceived market value. Sheriff Garrett's bank records showed regular cash deposits that far exceeded his official salary, and he had purchased expensive vehicles and property that couldn't be explained by his legitimate income as a small-town sheriff. In August 2015, I made contact with an FBI agent specializing in human trafficking and public corruption. Agent Sarah Thompson initially seemed skeptical about my allegations against local law enforcement. But the recorded conversations and documented evidence I provided convinced her to launch a federal investigation. The FBI's involvement required extreme caution because Sheriff Garrett had contacts throughout Kansas law enforcement who could have warned him about the investigation. I continued working my normal dispatch duties while wearing recording equipment and gathering additional evidence under FBI supervision. The federal investigation revealed that the Crossroads Junction trafficking network had been operating for over 7 years and had victimized more than 200 people during that time. Sheriff Garrett, Deputy Morrison, and 4 other law enforcement officers from surrounding counties were arrested on federal charges, including conspiracy, kidnapping, human trafficking, and civil rights violations. The investigation also uncovered corruption involving truck stop owners, motel managers, and trucking company dispatchers who had been paid to identify potential victims and facilitate their transportation to buyers in other states. The trials that followed exposed the full scope of the trafficking operation and its use of law enforcement authority to prey on the most vulnerable members of society. Survivors testified about being arrested on minor charges and then sold to traffickers instead of being processed through the normal legal system. Families of missing persons learned that their loved ones had been kidnapped and sold by the very law enforcement officers they had trusted to investigate the disappearances. The case became a landmark prosecution for human trafficking involving public corruption and resulted in life sentences for Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Morrison. What made this case particularly devastating was how the trafficking network had exploited public trust in law enforcement to facilitate their crimes. People who encountered Sheriff Garrett and his deputies believed they were dealing with legitimate peace officers who would protect them from harm. Instead, they were meeting predators who were evaluating them as potential merchandise for a criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. The badge and uniform that should have represented safety and protection were actually tools used to identify and capture victims for one of the most brutal forms of organized crime. I left Kansas immediately after the trials and now work in online customer service from my home in a different state. I can't bring myself to live in small rural communities anymore, and I have difficulty trusting local law enforcement even for routine matters. The experience taught me that some of the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind official authority and use their positions of trust to prey on people who have nowhere else to turn for help. Every time I hear about missing persons cases involving vulnerable individuals in small towns, I wonder if there are other dispatch centers where someone is logging evidence of trafficking operations and not understanding what they're witnessing. The scariest part wasn't the trafficking itself. It was discovering how easily law enforcement agencies can be corrupted and used to facilitate the very crimes they're supposed to prevent. Sheriff Garrett and his co-conspirators weren't rogue officers acting independently. They were part of a systematic criminal enterprise that used official law enforcement resources to kidnap and sell human beings for profit. The victims trusted them because they were police officers, and that trust made them perfect predators who could operate with impunity for years before anyone questioned their activities. My name is Walter, and I need to tell you about what happened to me and 11 other children at Camp Eagle Lake in Maine during the summer of 1996, when I was 12 years old. Camp Eagle Lake was advertised as a premier wilderness experience for boys aged 8 to 16, located on 200 acres of dense forest surrounding a pristine lake about 45 minutes north of Bangor. The camp promised to teach outdoor skills, character development, and self-reliance through activities like hiking, fishing, canoeing, and what they called survival training. My parents paid $3,200 for 8 weeks of what they believed would be a transformative summer experience that would help their shy, bookish son develop confidence and leadership skills. What they were actually paying for was access to a hunting ground where a predatory camp counselor named Derek Matthews used wilderness survival exercises to systematically terrorize, abuse, and hunt children for his own twisted entertainment. Camp Eagle Lake was owned and operated by Richard Brennan, a former military officer who had established the camp in 1988 with the mission of providing character-building experiences for young men through outdoor adventure and wilderness education. The camp attracted families from wealthy suburbs across New England who wanted their sons to experience the rugged independence that modern suburban life couldn't provide. Parents paid premium prices for what they believed was an elite program that would prepare their children for leadership roles in high school and college. The camp's brochures featured photos of happy boys around campfires, catching fish, and conquering challenging hiking trails under the supervision of experienced counselors and outdoor education specialists. Derek Matthews had been hired as the camp's wilderness survival instructor 3 years before I arrived, and he had quickly become one of the most popular counselors among both campers and parents. Derek was 28 years old, physically fit, charismatic, and possessed extensive knowledge of wilderness survival techniques that he claimed to have learned during military service and mountain rescue operations. He led specialized programs for older campers that involved multi-day wilderness expeditions, advanced survival skills training, and what he called leadership challenges, designed to test boys' mental and physical limits. Parents were impressed by Derek's credentials and his ability to push their sons beyond their comfort zones while maintaining what appeared to be appropriate safety standards. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during my second week at camp, when Derek selected me and 5 other boys for his advanced survival training program. He explained that we had been chosen because we showed exceptional potential for leadership and wilderness skills, and that we would be participating in increasingly challenging exercises designed to prepare us for real-world survival situations. The program involved spending nights alone in the forest, finding our own food and water, building shelters, and completing various tests of courage and endurance that Derek presented as necessary components of becoming capable young men. What Derek was actually doing was using the legitimate structure of wilderness education to isolate and terrorize children for his own psychological gratification. The survival exercises he designed were elaborate torture scenarios where he would abandon us in remote areas of the forest, sometimes for days at a time, while he stalked us like prey. He would appear unexpectedly to inflict physical and psychological punishment for imaginary failures, force us to endure exposure to elements and starvation as character building, and create situations where we believed our lives were in genuine danger from both natural hazards and Derek himself. The most horrifying aspect of Derek's abuse was how he framed it as educational and character building, convincing us that the terror and suffering we experienced were necessary parts of becoming strong, capable men. He would explain that modern society had made boys weak and dependent, and that only through extreme challenges could we develop the toughness and self-reliance that previous generations had possessed. When we begged to return to the main camp or tried to refuse participation in his exercises, Derek would shame us as weak and cowardly, threatening to inform our parents and the camp administrators that we had failed the program due to lack of character and courage. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical abuse. Derek convinced us that we were participating in a secret, elite program that separated us from the ordinary campers who weren't strong enough to handle real challenges. He created a twisted sense of pride and accomplishment around surviving his torture, making us feel that enduring his abuse was proof of our superiority and maturity. At the same time, he isolated us from the other campers and counselors, ensuring that we had no opportunity to report what was happening or seek help from adults who might have intervened. The survival training escalated throughout the summer as Derek became more confident that we wouldn't report him and that the camp administration wouldn't discover his activities. By July, he was conducting what he called manhunt exercises, where he would release us into the forest and then track us with weapons, knives, crossbows, and even a rifle that he claimed contained only blanks. The goal, according to Derek, was to teach us evasion and escape skills that could save our lives in real emergencies. In reality, these were hunting expeditions where Derek stalked terrified children through dense forest while armed with deadly weapons, creating genuine fear for our lives. During one of these manhunt exercises in late July, Derek's behavior crossed from systematic abuse into attempted murder. He had released 3 of us, myself, a 13-year-old boy named Tommy Chen, and a 14-year-old named Alex Rodriguez, into a remote section of the forest with instructions to reach a designated pickup point 10 miles away within 48 hours while avoiding capture. Derek gave us a 2-hour head start before beginning his pursuit, armed with a crossbow and hunting knife. What we discovered was that the pickup point didn't exist. Derek had sent us into the deepest, most dangerous part of the forest with no intention of allowing us to survive the exercise. For 3 days, Derek hunted us through the wilderness while we struggled to find food, water, and shelter. He would appear without warning to fire crossbow bolts that missed us by inches, clearly intended to wound or kill rather than simply frighten. On the second night, Tommy Chen fell into a ravine while trying to escape from Derek and broke his leg badly enough that he couldn't walk. Derek found Tommy the next morning, and instead of providing medical assistance, he told us that Tommy's injury was a learning experience, and that true survivors would either carry their wounded comrade or make the difficult decision to leave him behind. When Alex and I refused to abandon Tommy, Derek became enraged and revealed the true nature of his program. He explained that he had been conducting these final exercises with selected campers for 3 years, and that not all of the boys had survived their wilderness challenges. The camp's official records listed several previous participants as having been transferred to other programs or withdrawn by their parents. But Derek's casual references to boys who couldn't handle the ultimate test suggested a much darker reality. He told us that parents paid good money to turn their weak sons into men, and that sometimes the transformation process required sacrifice. Our escape came when Derek made the mistake of becoming too confident in his control over the situation. While he was occupied with torturing Tommy Chen, Alex and I managed to overpower him and take his weapons. We carried Tommy through the forest for nearly 12 hours until we reached a logging road, where we encountered a state park ranger who immediately recognized that we were in medical distress and called for emergency assistance. Tommy was airlifted to a hospital in Bangor, where he underwent surgery for his broken leg and severe dehydration, while Alex and I were treated for injuries, malnutrition, and exposure. The investigation that followed Derek's arrest revealed the full scope of his crimes at Camp Eagle Lake. Maine State Police found evidence that Derek had been systematically abusing campers since 1993, using increasingly violent survival exercises to torture children while hiding his activities under the guise of legitimate wilderness education. The investigation also discovered that 3 campers who had officially left the program early in previous years, had actually died during Derek's manhunt exercises and been buried in remote locations throughout the forest surrounding the camp. Richard Brennan and 2 other camp administrators were arrested for conspiracy and child endangerment after investigators discovered that they had received complaints about Derek's methods, but had covered up the incidents to protect the camp's reputation and financial interests. Camp Eagle Lake was shut down permanently, and the property was seized by the state as part of the criminal investigation. Derek Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without parole for multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, child abuse, and kidnapping. The psychological trauma from that summer took years of therapy to overcome, and I still struggle with anxiety and trust issues related to the experience. The most difficult aspect of healing was understanding that adults we trusted to protect us had instead facilitated our abuse, and that legitimate educational programs could be corrupted by predators who used their authority to harm children. 8 of us survived Derek's program, but we all carry permanent psychological scars from the summer when we learned that some monsters hide behind the facade of helping children become stronger and more capable. What happened at Camp Eagle Lake wasn't aberrant criminal behavior by a single predator. It was systematic child abuse enabled by institutional negligence and the willingness of adults to prioritize profits and reputation over child safety. Parents trusted the camp to provide challenging but safe experiences for their children. And that trust was betrayed by administrators who knew about Derek's abusive methods, but chose to cover them up rather than protect vulnerable children in their care. The scariest realization for me was understanding how easily predators can use legitimate authority and educational programs to access and abuse children while convincing everyone, including the victims, that the abuse is actually beneficial character development. Derek didn't just harm us physically and psychologically. He convinced us that enduring his torture made us special and superior, creating a twisted sense of pride that made it even harder to recognize the abuse and seek help. That's the real horror of predators like Derek Matthews. They don't just hurt children. They corrupt their understanding of strength, courage, and what it means to become a capable adult. My name is Elena, and I need to tell you about what happened in Ashwood, West Virginia in 2018, when the textile factory that had replaced our town's coal mines became the site of a preventable industrial disaster that killed 23 workers, including my father, Clayton Reed. I was 38 years old then, working as a nurse at the county hospital while my father worked the night shift at Ashwood Manufacturing, a facility that produced clothing and fabric goods for major retail chains. Ashwood was a former coal mining town of about 1,400 people in the southern part of the state, where generations of families had transitioned from mining to factory work when the last coal operation shut down in 2003. The textile factory provided steady employment for nearly 300 residents and was seen as the economic lifeline that kept our community alive after the collapse of the coal industry. Ashwood Manufacturing had been operating since 2005 in a converted warehouse that had previously housed mining equipment and coal processing machinery. The facility employed 3 shifts of workers who operated industrial sewing machines, fabric cutting equipment, and chemical treatment processes used to finish textiles for shipment to retailers across the country. My father had worked there for 12 years, starting as a maintenance worker and eventually becoming a shift supervisor responsible for ensuring that equipment operated safely and efficiently during the overnight hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Despite his experience and dedication to safety protocols, Clayton constantly complained about management's refusal to address obvious hazards that posed serious risks to worker safety and could result in catastrophic accidents if left uncorrected. The problems at Ashwood Manufacturing were well documented through worker complaints, union grievances, and inspection reports from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. But the company consistently chose to pay fines rather than invest in necessary safety improvements. The facility had inadequate fire suppression systems, blocked emergency exits, improperly stored flammable chemicals, and electrical systems that had been jury-rigged to handle loads far exceeding their design capacity. Workers had filed dozens of safety complaints with OSHA over the years. But the penalties for violations were so minimal that company management treated them as routine business expenses rather than urgent safety concerns that required immediate correction. My father had specifically warned management about the dangers posed by the facility's electrical infrastructure, which consisted of outdated wiring systems that had been repeatedly modified to accommodate new equipment without proper engineering oversight. Clayton documented multiple instances of electrical fires, power surges, and equipment failures that he attributed to the facility's inadequate electrical capacity and poor maintenance practices. He had submitted written reports to plant manager Susan Williams and safety director Mark Thompson detailing the specific hazards and recommending immediate upgrades to prevent a major electrical fire. But his warnings were dismissed as unnecessary expenses that would hurt the company's profitability. The fire started at 3:17 a.m. on November 15, 2018, when an overloaded electrical panel in the fabric treatment area sparked and ignited chemicals that had been improperly stored in violation of fire safety codes. Within minutes, the blaze had spread through the facility's inadequate ventilation system, filling the building with toxic smoke while flames consumed the highly flammable fabric materials stored throughout the production areas. The facility's fire suppression system failed to activate because it had been disabled to prevent accidental discharge that might damage expensive equipment and inventory. Emergency exits were blocked by storage containers and machinery that management had placed there to maximize production floor space, trapping workers in areas where they had no escape route from the rapidly spreading fire. 23 workers died in the Ashwood manufacturing fire, including my father, who was found near an emergency exit that had been chained shut to prevent theft of company property. The victims included men and women ranging in age from 19 to 67, many of whom had families depending on their income and had worked at the facility for years without any indication that their workplace was a death trap waiting to claim their lives. The official investigation revealed that every single fatality could have been prevented if the company had implemented basic fire safety measures that were required by law, but had been ignored to save money and maintain maximum production capacity. In the days following the fire, I began experiencing supernatural encounters that seemed connected to the workers who had died in the facility. The first incident occurred while I was cleaning out my father's locker at the factory ruins, where I heard Clayton's voice clearly warning me about the others who knew and telling me to find the reports they hid. When I turned around, I saw my father standing near the burned remnants of the electrical panel that had started the fire, looking exactly as he had in life, but with obvious smoke damage to his clothing and burns on his hands. He repeated his warning about hidden reports before pointing toward the administrative offices and disappearing. Over the following weeks, I encountered the spirits of other workers who had died in the fire, each providing information about the company's deliberate disregard for safety regulations and the cover-up that followed the disaster. Maria Santos, a 45-year-old sewing machine operator, showed me where management had hidden documentation of previous safety violations and OSHA fines. James Wilson, a 52-year-old maintenance worker, led me to evidence that the fire suppression system had been deliberately disabled on orders from corporate headquarters. Linda Foster, a 34-year-old quality control inspector, revealed the location of financial records showing that the company had calculated the cost of safety improvements versus the expected cost of wrongful death settlements and chosen to accept the human casualties as more profitable than preventing them. The supernatural encounters weren't random or symbolic. They were systematic efforts by the spirits of murdered workers to provide evidence of the criminal negligence that had caused their deaths. Each ghost showed me specific documents, recordings, and physical evidence that proved Ashwood Manufacturing's management had knowingly created deadly conditions while lying to workers, regulators, and the public about the facility's safety standards. The spirits seemed to understand that justice would only be served if the living had access to evidence that could expose the conspiracy and hold the responsible parties accountable for their crimes. The most disturbing revelation came when the ghost of my father led me to a hidden safe in the plant manager's office, containing records of deliberate safety violations ordered by the corporate parent company, Meridian Textiles. These documents proved that Ashwood Manufacturing was part of a nationwide network of facilities where safety regulations were systematically ignored to maximize profits, with corporate executives calculating that paying wrongful death settlements was cheaper than maintaining safe working conditions. The records showed similar incidents at Meridian facilities in North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, where workers had been killed in preventable accidents that were covered up through legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Using the evidence provided by the spirits of the dead workers, I contacted a team of investigative journalists and labor attorneys who specialized in industrial safety cases. The documentation I provided proved that the Ashwood fire wasn't an accident, but a predictable result of criminal negligence by company officials who had chosen profits over human lives. The investigation that followed revealed systematic violations of federal safety regulations, document destruction to hide evidence of known hazards, and bribery of local officials to prevent enforcement of safety codes that might have prevented the disaster. The federal prosecution that resulted from this investigation led to criminal charges against 12 company executives and plant managers, including CEO Richard Meridian, who received a 25-year sentence for conspiracy and criminally negligent homicide. The case became a landmark prosecution for industrial safety violations and resulted in new federal legislation requiring mandatory prison sentences for executives whose safety violations result in worker deaths. Meridian Textiles was forced to pay over $150 million in criminal fines and civil settlements to the families of workers killed in the Ashwood fire and similar incidents at other facilities. What made this case unique was the role that supernatural encounters played in uncovering evidence of corporate crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden. Without the guidance provided by the spirits of my father and his co-workers, the true scope of Meridian Textiles' criminal operations would never have been exposed, and the company would have continued operating facilities where workers faced daily risks of death from preventable hazards. The ghosts of the Ashwood victims had returned to ensure that their deaths weren't dismissed as unfortunate accidents, but recognized as murders committed by executives who valued profits more than human lives. I now work as a labor safety advocate, helping families of workers killed in industrial accidents to investigate the circumstances of those deaths and hold employers accountable for criminal negligence. The spirits of the Ashwood fire victims still appear to me occasionally, but their manifestations are peaceful rather than urgent warnings about danger. They seem satisfied that justice was served, and that their deaths led to changes in federal law that will protect other workers from similar fates. However, they also remind me that corporate executives continue to make calculated decisions to accept worker deaths as business expenses, and that vigilance is required to prevent future tragedies. The scariest part of this experience wasn't the supernatural encounters with the spirits of dead workers. It was discovering how easily corporations can murder their employees and cover up the crimes through legal settlements and regulatory capture. The executives at Meridian Textiles weren't monsters who set out to kill people, but business people who made rational economic calculations that human lives were worth less than safety improvements. They created systems where worker deaths were predictable, preventable, and profitable, then used their financial resources to avoid accountability when those deaths occurred as planned. The spirits of my father and his co-workers returned because they knew that living people needed supernatural help to expose crimes that powerful corporations could otherwise conceal forever. Sometimes, the dead are the only witnesses who can't be bought, intimidated, or silenced, and their testimony is necessary to achieve justice for victims of industrial murder. The Ashwood manufacturing fire wasn't a workplace accident. It was a mass killing carried out by executives who chose profit margins over human lives. And only the intervention of the dead could ensure that the truth was finally revealed to the living world. My name is Carlos, and I need to tell you about what I discovered as a Texas state trooper patrolling Highway 83 near Desert Cross, Texas, in 2019. Desert Cross was a small border town with a population of about 400 people, strategically located on a major truck route between Mexico and the interior United States. The town consisted of a few gas stations, a small grocery store, 2 motels, and Rodriguez Family BBQ, a roadside restaurant that had been serving travelers for over 15 years. I was 27 years old then, 3 years into my career with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and I thought I was dealing with routine traffic enforcement and border security issues in a quiet rural community. What I discovered was a cannibalistic operation that had been systematically murdering and serving travelers to unsuspecting customers for over a decade. Desert Cross existed primarily to serve the steady stream of truck drivers, tourists, and migrant workers who traveled Highway 83 between Laredo and San Antonio. The town's economy depended entirely on these transient visitors, who would stop for fuel, food, and rest before continuing their journeys across the vast expanses of South Texas. Rodriguez Family BBQ was the town's most popular establishment, known throughout the region for their authentic pit-smoked brisket, pork ribs, and homemade sausages that attracted customers from hundreds of miles away. The restaurant was owned and operated by the Rodriguez family. Patriarch Miguel Rodriguez, his wife Carmen, and their 3 adult sons who had been running the business since Miguel started it in 2003. My patrol sector covered approximately 200 miles of Highway 83 and several smaller state routes that connected isolated ranch communities to the main transportation corridor. The work involved traffic enforcement, accident investigation, and coordination with Border Patrol agents who monitored illegal immigration and drug trafficking activities in the area. Desert Cross was generally considered one of the safer stops along my patrol route, with low crime rates and a business community that cooperated fully with law enforcement. Miguel Rodriguez was particularly helpful, often providing information about suspicious vehicles or individuals who had stopped at his restaurant, and he had assisted with several successful drug interdiction operations over the years. The first indication that something was wrong came in March 2019, when I noticed an unusual pattern in missing person reports involving travelers who had last been seen in or near Desert Cross. Over a 6-month period, I had logged 12 separate cases where individuals or families had disappeared while traveling Highway 83, with their last confirmed locations being gas stations or restaurants in Desert Cross. These weren't typical cases of people changing their plans or getting lost. These were situations where vehicles were found abandoned, families failed to arrive at their destinations, and credit card activity stopped abruptly after purchases in Desert Cross. What made these disappearances particularly suspicious was that they all involved travelers who fit similar profiles. People traveling alone or in small groups, without extensive family connections, who would immediately notice their absence, and often carrying significant amounts of cash or valuable possessions. Migrant workers heading north for seasonal employment, retirees driving cross-country in RVs, and small families relocating to new jobs were the typical victims. These were people whose disappearances might not be reported immediately, and who could vanish without generating the kind of intensive law enforcement response that would threaten whatever was causing them to disappear. I began conducting more frequent patrols through Desert Cross and paying closer attention to the activities at Rodriguez Family BBQ, which seemed to be the common factor in many of the disappearance cases. The restaurant was always busy, with a steady stream of customers praising Miguel's cooking and the quality of his meat, which he claimed came from cattle raised on local ranches. What bothered me was that I never saw any cattle trucks making deliveries to the restaurant, and Miguel's meat orders from legitimate suppliers seemed insufficient to support the volume of food he was serving to customers. When I asked Miguel about his meat sources, he was evasive and mentioned local arrangements with ranchers who preferred to deal directly rather than go through commercial processing facilities. The breakthrough came when I discovered the abandoned vehicle of Thomas and Linda Morrison, a retired couple from Ohio who had been driving to Arizona to visit their grandchildren. Their RV was found in a remote area about 10 miles from Desert Cross, apparently disabled by mechanical problems that had forced them to seek assistance. According to witnesses at Rodriguez Family BBQ, the Morrisons had eaten lunch at the restaurant and asked Miguel for recommendations about getting their RV repaired. Miguel had offered to have his son Eduardo help them with the mechanical problems and had driven them to their vehicle to assess the situation. That was the last time anyone reported seeing the Morrisons alive. When I processed the Morrisons' RV as evidence, I found clear signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, including blood spatter patterns that suggested violence had occurred after the mechanical breakdown. More importantly, I discovered that the RV's engine problems had been deliberately caused by someone who knew enough about automotive mechanics to disable the vehicle in a way that would require outside assistance. The fuel lines had been cut, the battery cables had been severed, and the ignition system had been sabotaged to prevent the vehicle from starting. These weren't random mechanical failures. They were calculated acts of sabotage designed to strand the Morrisons in a remote location where they would be completely dependent on whoever offered to help them. I started conducting surveillance of Rodriguez Family BBQ using unmarked vehicles and concealed observation points that allowed me to monitor the restaurant's activities without being detected. What I observed was a sophisticated operation where Miguel and his sons would identify suitable victims among the restaurant's customers, follow them when they left, and then sabotage their vehicles to create opportunities for abduction. The Rodriguez family had an extensive knowledge of the remote roads and abandoned areas surrounding Desert Cross, and they used this familiarity to isolate victims in locations where no one would witness their crimes or discover evidence of their activities. The most disturbing discovery came when I obtained a search warrant for Rodriguez Family BBQ and the family's residential property behind the restaurant. In the restaurant's walk-in freezer, forensic investigators found human remains that had been processed and stored alongside legitimate meat products. The family had been systematically murdering travelers, butchering their bodies, and mixing the human flesh with pork and beef to create the restaurant's signature dishes that had attracted customers from across South Texas. DNA analysis of the meat products confirmed that at least 18 different individuals had been processed through the Rodriguez family's cannibalistic operation. The investigation also revealed the full scope of the family's criminal enterprise, which had been operating since 2005 and had victimized dozens of travelers over 14 years. Miguel Rodriguez had developed techniques for identifying vulnerable victims, disabling their vehicles, luring them to isolated locations, and disposing of their bodies through his restaurant's food service operation. The family had generated substantial profits, not only from selling human flesh to unsuspecting customers, but also from stealing their victims' vehicles, cash, jewelry, and other valuables that could be sold through criminal networks along the border. What made this case particularly horrific was the realization that hundreds of innocent customers had unknowingly consumed human flesh while dining at Rodriguez Family BBQ. The restaurant's reputation for exceptional barbecue had been built on the systematic murder and cannibalization of travelers who had trusted Miguel Rodriguez to provide assistance when their vehicles broke down. The family had perverted the traditional hospitality of border communities, using offers of help and quality food to lure victims into situations where they could be murdered and processed as ingredients for future meals. The evidence we gathered included detailed records that Miguel had kept of his victims, including their names, physical descriptions, and notes about which parts of their bodies produced the best meat for different menu items. He had treated human beings like livestock, evaluating their potential value as food products, while maintaining the facade of a friendly restaurant owner who cared about his customers' welfare. The Rodriguez family had created a systematic process for murder, butchering, and cannibalism that operated under the cover of a legitimate business in a community that trusted them completely. Miguel Rodriguez, his wife Carmen, and their 3 sons were all arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and operating a criminal enterprise. The trials revealed evidence of at least 27 confirmed murders, though investigators believe the actual number of victims was much higher based on the volume of human remains found at the restaurant and the family's residential property. Miguel received the death penalty, while the other family members received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Rodriguez Family BBQ was demolished, and the entire property was declared a crime scene that remained sealed by federal authorities. The case became one of the largest serial killing investigations in Texas history and led to new protocols for investigating missing persons cases involving travelers in remote border areas. The FBI established a task force to review similar disappearances throughout the Southwest, and several other cases have been linked to copycat operations that may have been inspired by the Rodriguez family's methods. The investigation also revealed that some customers had suspected something was wrong with the restaurant's meat, but had been too polite or uncertain to report their concerns to authorities. I left the Texas State Troopers after the Rodriguez trials and now work as a security consultant for private companies. I can't drive through small border towns anymore without thinking about what might be happening in their restaurants and truck stops. The case taught me that some of the most dangerous criminals are the ones who hide behind facades of hospitality and community service, using people's trust and vulnerability to facilitate unthinkable crimes. Miguel Rodriguez wasn't just a serial killer. He was a businessman who had found a way to profit from murder while disposing of the evidence by serving it to his customers. The scariest realization was understanding how easily this operation could have continued indefinitely if the Morrison case hadn't provided the evidence we needed to expose the truth. The Rodriguez family had created a perfect system for making people disappear while generating profits from their deaths. And they had operated for 14 years without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or the community. Their crimes were hidden in plain sight, disguised as exceptional barbecue that customers praised and recommended to their friends, never knowing they were consuming the flesh of murdered travelers who had trusted the wrong people. For help in their time of need. My name is Dr. Patricia Wells, and my real identity must remain protected for reasons that will become clear as I tell you what I witnessed in Harmony Springs, North Dakota, in the summer of 2020. I was 44 years old then, working as an epidemiologist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, specializing in infectious disease outbreaks and bioterrorism response. Harmony Springs was an agricultural town of 2,100 people located in the wheat-growing region of central North Dakota, surrounded by thousands of acres of farmland and connected to the outside world primarily by State Highway 3 and a BNSF railway line that carried grain shipments to markets in Minneapolis and Chicago. The town had existed since 1891. built around grain elevators and farming cooperatives that supported the area's agricultural economy. And it represented the kind of stable, close-knit rural community that forms the backbone of America's food production system. I was dispatched to Harmony Springs on July 18, 2020, as part of a CDC rapid response team investigating reports of an unusual illness outbreak that had been reported by the town's only physician, Dr. Michael Torres. According to Dr. Torres's initial report, approximately 300 residents had developed symptoms including severe headaches, disorientation, memory loss, and behavioral changes that didn't match any known infectious disease patterns. The North Dakota Department of Health had requested federal assistance after local medical facilities became overwhelmed with patients exhibiting identical symptoms that appeared to be spreading throughout the community at an unprecedented rate. Our team's mission was to identify the causative agent, implement containment measures, and prevent the outbreak from spreading to surrounding communities. When we arrived in Harmony Springs, what we found defied every protocol and classification system we had for infectious disease outbreaks. The affected residents weren't sick in any conventional sense. They were different. Families who had lived in the community for generations were exhibiting personality changes, altered speech patterns, and knowledge of information they shouldn't have possessed. Children were speaking with adult vocabularies and discussing complex topics they had never been exposed to, while elderly residents were demonstrating physical capabilities and mental acuity that seemed impossible for their age and health conditions. Most disturbing was the way these changes seemed to be spreading from person to person through direct contact, but without any identifiable pathogen or biological mechanism that could explain the transmission. Our initial medical examinations revealed abnormalities that challenged our understanding of human biology and consciousness. Brain scans showed unusual neural activity patterns in affected individuals, with increased connectivity between regions that normally don't communicate extensively. Blood tests revealed the presence of microscopic organisms that didn't match any known bacteria, virus, parasite, or fungus in our databases. These organisms appeared to be some form of complex, multicellular entity that existed primarily within the nervous system and seemed capable of altering brain function in ways that modern medicine couldn't explain or categorize. Most importantly, these organisms were clearly transmissible between humans through direct physical contact, saliva exchange, and possibly airborne exposure during close interaction. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came when I conducted extended interviews with recently affected residents and compared their responses to interviews I had conducted with the same individuals immediately after our arrival. People who had been infected with these organisms weren't just sick. Their personalities, memories, and knowledge base had been completely replaced by something else. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher, was suddenly able to discuss advanced quantum physics and spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese, despite having no previous exposure to either subject. Her husband, Robert, who had worked as a mechanic for 40 years, was now demonstrating intimate knowledge of agricultural techniques used in prehistoric civilizations and could perform complex mathematical calculations in his head that would challenge university professors. The most terrifying realization was that these weren't random knowledge acquisitions or enhanced cognitive abilities. The infected residents were accessing information that belonged to other consciousness entities, either from other infected humans or from some kind of collective intelligence that was using the mysterious organisms to take control of human bodies and minds. Harmony Springs hadn't been struck by a disease outbreak. It was being systematically invaded by some form of parasitic consciousness that was replacing the original personalities and memories of the town's residents with those of the invading entities. The people I was interviewing looked like the original residents, but they were actually being controlled by something else that was wearing their bodies as disguises. By the fourth day of our investigation, it became clear that our team was also at risk of infection. Two of my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Kim and epidemiologist James Wright, began exhibiting the same personality changes and knowledge alterations that we had observed in the town's residents. Dr. Kim, who had specialized in viral infections for 15 years, was suddenly discussing advanced engineering principles and speaking in what appeared to be multiple ancient languages. James Wright, who had grown up in suburban Chicago, was demonstrating extensive knowledge of North Dakota agricultural history and could identify specific wheat varieties by sight despite having no previous agricultural experience. Both insisted they felt completely normal and claimed not to understand why I was concerned about their behavior. The scope of the invasion became apparent when I realized that the organisms were not only taking control of individual humans, but were also establishing some form of collective communication network between all infected residents. Groups of infected people would stand together in perfect silence, apparently communicating through methods that didn't involve speech or visible signals. They moved with coordinated precision, completed each other's sentences, and seemed to share knowledge instantaneously across the entire infected population. Harmony Springs was being converted into a single, collective organism that used human bodies as components in a larger intelligence system. Our communication with CDC headquarters in Atlanta became increasingly difficult as more of our team became infected, and the town's residents began coordinating to prevent us from leaving or reporting what we had discovered. Phone lines were cut, internet access was blocked, and our vehicles were disabled by residents who demonstrated mechanical knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. The infected population wasn't trying to spread the infection beyond Harmony Springs. They were working to contain it within the town while perfecting their control over the human hosts and establishing their collective intelligence system. We weren't dealing with a disease outbreak that needed to be contained. We were witnessing an invasion by an intelligence that was using biological agents to take over human bodies and create a new form of life. The final phase of the invasion occurred when the collective intelligence began demonstrating advanced technological capabilities that exceeded anything in our scientific understanding. Infected residents working together constructed complex electronic devices using materials scavenged from farm equipment, household appliances, and our own medical equipment. These devices appeared to serve as amplifiers for the collective communication network and allowed the parasitic consciousness to exert even more precise control over their human hosts. More importantly, the devices seemed capable of accelerating the infection process and could convert a normal human into a controlled host within hours, rather than the days we had initially observed. My escape from Harmony Springs came when I realized that the collective intelligence was planning to use our CDC credentials and official vehicles to spread the infection to other communities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate federal health officials conducting routine disease investigations. I managed to steal one of our backup vehicles and drove non-stop to Grand Forks, where I immediately contacted military authorities and requested quarantine enforcement for the entire Harmony Springs area. What I told them was that we had discovered a biological agent that posed an existential threat to human civilization and required immediate military containment using protocols designed for the most dangerous biological weapons. The military response to Harmony Springs was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, the town was surrounded by Army units equipped with biological warfare protective equipment and orders to prevent anyone from leaving the quarantine zone. Long-range surveillance confirmed that the infected residents were continuing to exhibit coordinated behavior patterns and were attempting to construct additional technological devices that might allow them to communicate with or control entities outside the quarantine area. After 72 hours of observation, military commanders made the decision to sterilize the entire area using incendiary weapons that would eliminate both the biological organisms and any technology they had created. The official record states that Harmony Springs was evacuated due to a catastrophic grain elevator explosion that resulted in an uncontrollable fire that consumed the entire town. Military personnel conducted extensive decontamination procedures to ensure that no biological agents survived the sterilization process. And the area remains under federal control as a designated environmental hazard zone. The families of Harmony Springs residents were told that their loved ones died in the industrial accident and were provided with substantial compensation payments, along with non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from discussing the circumstances of their losses. What happened in Harmony Springs represents the closest humanity has come to being replaced by an alien intelligence that uses biological warfare to take control of human consciousness and convert our species into components of a collective organism. The parasitic entities we encountered demonstrated capabilities that suggest advanced understanding of neurobiology, genetics, and consciousness transfer that exceeds our current scientific knowledge by centuries or millennia. They were able to preserve human memories and personalities while overlaying them with their own intelligence, creating hybrid beings that retained enough human characteristics to avoid detection while serving the goals of the invading collective. The most terrifying aspect of this encounter wasn't the biological organisms or the consciousness transfer technology. It was realizing how easily an entire human community could be converted into something else, while maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior. If I hadn't been specifically trained to notice subtle changes in behavior and cognitive patterns, the invasion of Harmony Springs might have gone undetected until the collective intelligence was ready to spread beyond the original town and begin converting larger populations. The infected residents weren't monsters or obviously dangerous entities. They were perfect copies of the original humans, controlled by something that understood human behavior well enough to mimic it convincingly. I now work under an assumed identity in a location that must remain classified, continuing my research into biological threats that could pose existential risks to human civilization. The organisms we encountered in Harmony Springs were unlike anything in our scientific databases, suggesting they were either artificially created bioweapons or entities from an environment completely different from Earth's biosphere. Military intelligence agencies continue to monitor for similar outbreaks. But I believe the Harmony Springs incident was only the first attempt by these entities to establish a foothold in human society. And they are probably adapting their methods based on what they learned from our containment response. The official story of Harmony Springs will never acknowledge what really happened there, because the truth would cause panic and social breakdown that might be more dangerous than the original threat. But people need to understand that consciousness itself can be weaponized, and that our individual identities and free will are not as secure as we believe them to be. The entities that invaded Harmony Springs demonstrated that human consciousness can be overwritten, modified, or replaced while leaving the original body intact and functional. They proved that our sense of self, our memories, and our personalities exist as biological data that can be manipulated by sufficiently advanced technology. If you've made it this far through these 11 stories, you've heard testimonies about the darkest secrets hidden in small-town America. From systematic corruption to supernatural encounters to threats that challenge our understanding of reality itself. These aren't just horror stories meant to entertain you. They're warnings about the dangers that exist in the places where we're supposed to feel safest. The people who shared these experiences risked everything to expose the truth. And some of them paid the ultimate price for speaking out against forces that most people refuse to believe exist. Remember that evil often hides behind facades of authority, community service, and institutional respectability. The most dangerous predators are the ones who use our trust against us. And the most horrific crimes are often committed by people we're taught to respect and obey. Question everything, document what you observe, and never assume that official explanations tell the whole story. If these stories have kept you awake at night or made you question what's really happening in the small towns around us, then hit that subscribe button and join the Verified Fears family. We're building a community of truth seekers who refuse to look away from the darkness that others pretend doesn't exist. Like this video if it opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, and share it with someone who needs to hear these warnings. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who might recognize similar patterns in their own communities. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and remember, sometimes the most important truths are the ones that make us the most uncomfortable.